Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a rainy morning, but welcome to the Season 2 of Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. So this is the opening seminar for this semester. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mahalea Ravago, Associate Professor from the Department of Economics. Let me tell you our house rules for those of you who are just joining us for this semester seminar. We will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. During the question and answer, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. Participants on Facebook, welcome. Please post your questions in the comment sections. The slide, videos, and other materials from the seminar will be posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. We are very lucky this morning to have as our speaker, Professor Keijiro Otsuka is a professor of development of economics at the Graduate School of Economics, Kobe University, and a chief senior researcher at the Institute of Development Economics. He has been a member of the Japan Academy since 2018. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1979. He served as chairman of the board of trustees of the International Rice Research Institute from 2004 to 2007, and president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists from 2009 to 2012. He has been serving as president of the Japanese Association for Development Economics since 2018. He received the Purple Ribbon Medal from the Japanese government in 2010. So this morning, he will be with us to present his paper titled Changing Relationship Between Farm Size and Productivity and its Implication for Philippine Agriculture. Without further ado, let's all welcome Professor Keijiro Otsuka. The virtual floor is yours. Professor Otsuka? You are still muted. Kindly unmute yourself. Yes, we can hear you now.
画面を共有
してますですもんね。で、出されるのは
いい。
これはあれじゃなくて、ここ一つ。こ
これ？これ？
はい。これのところ。
I have never had this problem before.
Now we can hear you now.
Yeah, I cannot get my screen.
Oh, we can see your screen already.
Oh?
Yes, it just needs to be in slideshow mode.
I cannot see my screen.
Okay. Hold on. Rainer, three times. Can you stop share so that they can share?
Okay.
Oh, you can see.
It's getting better.
Oh, wait. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, you can. Okay.
And then,
yeah, you can see it.
Okay.
Slideshow.
Okay, from the. So, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I had some mechanical problems. So I'd like to talk about changing relationship between farm size and productivity and its implication for the Philippine agriculture. Let me begin with my introduction. In the first sentence of my paper, I said no controversy in the history of agricultural economics is more perennial than the relationship between farm size and productivity. That's the first sentence of the paper. But actually, 30 years ago, I said the same thing. No controversy in the history of agricultural economics is more perennial than the inefficiency of certainty. There is a little bit of difference between the two sentences, but they are almost the same. But there is no inconsistency between the two statements because I resolved the issue of certainty, the second issue in the early 1990s in my paper published in Journal of Economic Literature. So, the purpose of my presentation today is to end the first controversy. That's my the purpose. And then I'd like to make a very brief literature review. Some economists, including Gershon Feder, and Michael Lipton, and Amartya Sen, and others believe that there is inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. So small farms are more efficient than large farms. That's what IR, inverse relationship, means. There are, however, economists who believe that large farms are more efficient than small farms, like Paul Collier and so on. And also many policymakers tend to believe that large farms are more efficient. Actually, inverse relationship is found in many developing countries, particularly in India. There are a bunch of studies which found inverse relationship using Indian data. And I argued, and also my colleagues found, that inverse relation has been weakened or even reversed in high-performing developing countries, particularly in Asian countries. So I have three specific purposes in my presentation today. First one is to identify causes of changing relationship between farm size and productivity based on the literature review. Secondly, I try to review changes in farm size and grain self-sufficiency ratio. There's some type of self-sufficiency ratio over time in selected Asian countries, in order to examine broadly how farm size is related with comparative advantage of agriculture. And then finally, I'll try to draw policy implications of changing relationship between farm size and productivity for the future of Philippine agriculture, based on the review of rice farming system in Central Luzon from 1966 to 2015. Now let me move on to section 2, entitled Economics of Farm Size Productivity Relationship. Let us think about production function in low-wage economy. Q is output per hectare. LF is a family labor use per hectare. LH is a higher labor use per hectare. And X is a purchased inputs like fertilizer per hectare. I did not include the K capital intentionally to emphasize importance of other factors. Argument of Gershon-Feder is higher labor shocks. Hired workers never work seriously as much as employer wants. And that leads to the situation in which, since large farms employ more higher labor, yield is lower on large farms than on small farms. That leads to inverse relationship. So higher labor doesn't work. That's the main point of Gershon-Feder. And Hayami and myself, Hayami is of course very well-known professor who passed away 6-7 years ago. He was my advisor. We argued that the labor market in care-intensive activities never work efficiently in spatially dispersed and ecologically diverse agriculture production environment because of the high monitoring cost of higher labor. So this point is the same as the point made by Gershon-Feder. Care-intensive activities include land preparation, water control, supervision of higher labor, and so on. So some care is needed in those activities. Therefore, family labor is used in such care-intensive activity as land preparation, water control, fertilizer application, and the supervision of higher labor. And higher labor markets work only in such simple activities as weeding, transplanting, harvesting, and threshing. But in care-intensive activities, higher labor market never work. That's our argument. This argument is consistent with the fact that roughly 90% of farms, family farms, rely on family labor in the world. There is no problem of shirking in the case of family labor. Okay, I have a question for you. Some of you are students, right? So this is a quiz for you. This is a very important quiz. I assume that there are two farms producing the same product using the same technology. Farm A, which owns 4 hectares, and there is only 1 worker. Farm B owns 2 hectares of land, and there are 2 workers. This allocation of resources is not efficient because Farm A cultivates too much land compared with the Farm B, whereas Farm B has too many workers. In fact, crop yield per hectare is higher on Farm B than on Farm A. This is not a Pareto optimum. So there are 2 possible solutions. One is a land transaction. Farm A may rent out 2 hectares of land to Farm B. Then land worker ratio, land labor ratio ratios are equalized. Or labor hiring. Farm A hired one worker from farm B. Then again, labor capital ratios are equalized. So land transaction and land labor hiring lead to the same result? No, not at all. Point is, the yield is lower on farm A after transaction. Yield is lower on farm A than on farm B in the second arrangement because the worker from farm B will not work seriously on farm A. So labor hiring does not help very much. So yield is lower on farm A than farm B in the second arrangement. So in other words, labor hiring arrangement is inefficient because of the shirking of labor or because of the malfunctioning of labor market. This is the fundamental characteristics of agriculture. Please keep it in mind. In the case of labor hiring, efficiency cannot be, Pareto optimality cannot be attained. Another point is that as far as tenant works diligently, or then land market works, actually my main argument is tenancy system is efficient. That is the main point of the paper published in Journal of Economic Literature in 1992. So I assume that tenant works diligently. Then if tenancy transaction can be made freely, then we'll never observe inverse relationship because the through land renting, labor land ratios will be equalized across all the farms if land market works. Now, let us think about production function in high wage economy. This function is similar to the earlier one, but we now have a K here. K is the capital service per hectare. So some mechanization is taking place. Mechanization is adopted because wage is high and the mechanization helps save the labor cost. Particularly introduction of tractor reduces the demand for family labor. Also supervision of hired workers in mechanized tasks is not so difficult. Therefore, advantage of small farm declines and disadvantage of large farms also declines with mechanization, or advantage of large farms increases relative to small farms as mechanization takes place. This will lead to the weakening of inverse relationship because disadvantage of large farms declines. Furthermore, mechanization may lead to scale economies or increase in optimum farm size. That leads to emergence of positive relationship between farm size and productivity. Now I have a revised simple quiz for you. Like before, I again assume that there are two farms producing the same product using the same technology. Farm A, 4 hectares on worker. Farm B, 2 hectares to workers. So what would be optimum arrangement, optimum transaction? Since there are scale economies, renting out 2 hectares from farm A to farm B is not efficient solution. We create just 2 small farms. It's not efficient transaction. Renting 2 hectares from farm B to farm A, that's much better. Or renting 4 hectares of land from farm A to farm B is more efficient solution. So it depends on the return to scale in production function. If it's a constant returns like before, that was implicitly assumed, then the renting land from large farm to small farm contributes to the efficiency of land use. But if there are scale economies, renting from small farms to large farms is more efficient, or putting together all the land in the small farms may be efficient. So we must recall that in developed countries, landlords are usually small farmers. Small farmers and tenants are large farmers. In other words, small farmers rent out the land to tenants, and tenants are large farmers because tenants accumulate land from various small farmers. Methodological issues about inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. Several economists argue that since yield per hectare or gross value of production per hectare is not appropriate measure of production efficiency. Therefore, total factor productivity, TFP, or profit per hectare should be used to examine the relationship between farm size and productivity. So they simply argue that we should forget about the yield or gross value of production per hectare. Look at the TFP or profit. I do not necessarily agree. In order to estimate TFP or profit per hectare, we must estimate the cost of unpaid family labor by imputation. Usually, we use the prevailing wage rate in the market, but imputation is always subject to errors. So therefore, it is risky to show only profit per hectare or TFP. I recommend to examine the farm size and productivity relationship in terms of gross value of production per hectare, net value of production per hectare after subtracting paid out cost, and also profit per hectare. It will be safer to look at the gross value, net value, and profit rather than just look at the profit alone. That's my first argument. Now let us move on to a review of empirical evidence. I spent a lot of time to review. According to Del Box, PSGO, and Paloma, they are working at the research sector of EU in Brussels. They found that the strong inverse relationship tend to be found when gross value of output or physical yield per hectare is used to measure productivity. The weaker inverse relation is generally found when net value of output is used after subtracting paid out cost. And then farm side productivity relationship becomes unclear when profit or TFP is used. So this figure illustrates the relationship. Sorry, I forgot to include one more line. Anyway, so if we use the gross value of production per hectare, we tend to observe very strong inverse relationship between farm side and productivity. If we use net value of production per hectare as the measure of productivity, then the slope may be less steep. And if we impute family labor cost and the other cost of owned resources, profit, that should be a horizontal line here. That shows the profit. According to their study, relationship between profit and farm size is unclear. Since the small farms use a lot of family labor, if the family labor cost is properly imputed, profit tends to become smaller. So as a result, in total, the relationship between profit and farm size is unclear. And other studies, like my study published in AJAE, find the weakening tendency of IR inverse relationship in several Asian countries where mechanization has been taking place. And also, according to some studies in Japan, US, and Australia, positive relationship between farm size and productivity is observed. Several studies in China, Brazil, and Pakistan found a U-shaped relationship between farm size and productivity. This figure illustrates or summarizes their finding. So if labor-intensive traditional production technology is employed, we tend to observe inverse relationship. If mechanization has taken place, there are some scale economies and scale advantages arise, and we tend to observe positive relationship. And if labor-intensive production method and capital-intensive production method coexist, we may observe U-shaped relationship between the farm size and productivity. So if traditional labor-intensive farming system is adopted, we tend to observe inverse relationship. If capital-intensive mechanization system is adopted, we tend to observe positive relationship. If labor-intensive and capital-intensive farming systems coexist, we tend to observe a U-shaped relationship. Relationship between farm size and productivity in Asian countries are moving from IR to U-shape or even positive relationship. In order to reap the benefits of increasing advantage of large farms in Asia, obviously farm size expansion and mechanization must take place. So that's the end of section 3, review of the empirical evidence. I now move on to the future of small farms in Asia. Small farms in Asia have been losing the advantage of using family labor as wage rates rise and mechanization takes place. Thus, farm size must expand to prevent agriculture's unnecessary, I want to emphasize this, unnecessarily large loss of comparative advantage. Otherwise, food self-sufficiency ratio will decline in the East Asian region. So let us take a look at figure 3. This figure compares changes in average farm size in selected East Asian countries. Thailand and Philippines used to have very large farms. Average farm size in the 1960s was 3.5 hectares. And then in Thailand, it declined a little bit, but still average farm size in Thailand is more than 3 hectares. Worrisome is the Philippines, 3.5 hectares per 3.5 hectares per farm on average in the 1960s, but it has declined very, very sharply. Now it's less than 1.5 hectares or 1.3 hectares or something. So this looks problematic. This is Japan. Farm size was very tiny in the 1960s, but it has increased to 3 hectares. But this is very tiny compared with other advanced countries. In Europe, 50 hectares is more or less common. In the US, if we forget about the grazing areas and only cultivated areas, maybe average farm size in the US is 100 hectares. Japan, 3 hectares, that's too tiny. But China is problematic. The land size in China is large, but there are so many people. Therefore, the average farm size was 0.7 hectare, declined to almost 0.5. It has been increasing. Now it's 0.8. It's so tiny. It's so tiny. And then mechanization is taking place. I wonder if machines can be used efficiently on such small farms. So farm size is increasing in Japan, but it's only 3 hectares. Rapidly declining farm size in the Philippines is particularly worrisome. And also very small farm size in China seems problematic. This figure shows changes in grain sufficiency ratio, self-sufficiency ratio. Selected East Asian countries. Thailand has been an exporter, so self-sufficiency ratio exceeds 1, but it has been declining. Shocking is the sharp declining trend of self-sufficiency ratio in Korea, South Korea, and Japan. It's only it used to be 70% or something. It's now a little bit higher than 20%. Of course, loss of comparative advantage is not that as economic growth and factor endowment change. Some countries would lose comparative advantage. That cannot be avoided. But these countries, Japan and Korea, preserve very inefficient small farms, and that as a result, a lot of import must be made. So there are distortions by the government. Small farms are preserved. That's the problem. And the worrisome is the Philippines. Self-sufficiency ratio has been declining. So of course, self-sufficiency ratio is affected by many factors, not only by farm size, but at least farm size seems to be closely related with the level and changes in self-sufficiency ratio. So in the future for small farms in Asia, my answer is definitely no, hopeless. Grain sufficiency ratio has been sharply declining in countries where farm size is small and wage rates are high, notably Japan and South Korea. Yet farm size is declining in most Asian countries. Farm size has been increasing in Japan, but it's very tiny. Farm size in China is shockingly small. If East Asian countries continue to preserve small farms, they will become a major importer of food grains, which will shoot up the world grain prices, adversely affecting the well-being of consumers throughout the world, particularly the poor ones in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. So loss of comparative advantage in agriculture in East Asia is not a local issue. It's a global global issue and major issue. It is very instructive to look at the changes in rice farming system in Central Luzon, as you can see. In order to understand fundamental features of agriculture, it's useful to examine the household data of rice farmers collected by Central Luzon Group Survey, conducted roughly every 4 years since 1966, before Green Revolution began. In 1986, I organized the survey. So the quality of the data in 1986 is particularly high, I believe. Sample size of this survey is not very large. Sometimes smaller than 100. It exceeded 100, but it has declined again. But still, we can see a lot of interesting information. Farm size increased a little bit, and then it became 2.6 hectares per farm, but it has declined to 1.8. But the reduction is not too much. Paddy yield increased from 2.3 tons per hectare to 4.1 tons per hectare, owing to the Green Revolution. And then there was the ups and downs, but more or less the yield has been almost constant for the last 25 years or so, 35 years. And then interesting is a major change in labor use per hectare. It was 69 days, and it increased to 85 days as new varieties were introduced and more fertilizers were applied and so on. So there was some intensification of rice farming in terms of labor use, but it has declined, and it has become just 1/2 in recent year. So what happened? I think of, okay. So what happened? Several important observations can be made from figure 5. Let us go to figure 5. This one shows changes in family and higher labor use for care-intensive activities like land preparation, fertilizer application, water control, supervision of workers, and other relatively simple activities like transplanting, weeding, threshing, and harvesting. If we look at care-intensive activities, this is a family labor. Family labor was very important for care-intensive activities. This is the care-intensive activities by higher level. Primarily, hired workers are drivers of caravan or tractor. So primarily, it's a family workers who were engaged in land preparation and other care-intensive activities. But it has declined a lot. So in this period, family labor was important, but probably due to mechanization, family labor use has declined a lot. So that means the family labor is not very important. That means that the small farms, which are endowed with a lot of family labor, do not lose the comparative advantage in farming. If we look at other simple activities, it is primarily higher labor. Higher labor was primary input for simple activities. So, and then it has been almost constant, but it's interesting that it dropped so sharply in the last, from 2011 to 2015. On the other hand, for other simple activities, family labor use is minimal. And family labor was used particularly for supervision of workers. But as the higher labor declines, maybe supervision time also decline. So let me repeat the same thing. Traditionally, in the 1960s and 70s, family labor was primarily used for care-intensive activities. And higher labor has been predominantly used for simple tasks, particularly from 1966 to 2000. I cannot see the number. And then family labor use in care-intensive activities declined from 24 days per hectare in 1966 to only 7.5 days per hectare in 2015, indicating the advantage of small farms arising from intensive use of family labor would have declined. And all of a sudden, higher labor use dropped from 2011 to 2015, indicating that disadvantage of large farms arising from intensive use of higher labor decline. So we have seen the significant changes in labor use. That has something to do with mechanization. Let me show you. This is the use of power tillers. This has been increasing, replacing caravan. That is called animal here. Animal use has been declining, and power tiller use has been increasing. This reduces the demand for family labor for land preparation. Also, there was some increase in use of riding tractors. That will, of course, contribute to the reduction in family labor use. And then 2011, adoption rate of combine harvester was 0, but it became more than 40% in 2015. Significant reduction in family labor use corresponds to increasing use of power tillers, as well as riding tractors and cultivators. And slight increase in higher labor use in care-intensive activities can be explained by employment of drivers of power tillers and tractors. And then sharp reduction in higher labor use in simple tasks from 2011 to 2015 can be explained by introduction of combine harvesters. But all in all, advantage of small farms declines and disadvantage of large farms are also reduced by tractorization. Whereas disadvantage of large farm is further reduced by the introduction of combine harvesters. So let me move on to the final subsection of section 5. that is concerned with land reform in the Philippines. If small farms are more efficient than large farms, redistributive land reform, which is also called the Land to the Tiller program, redistribution of land from large landowners to landless or near landless tenants, implemented in the Philippines, also in India, is potentially conducive to both efficiency and equity. The fundamental problem is that the land reform program suppresses non-tenancy transactions, thereby preventing efficient transfer of land from inefficient to efficient farmers. This was pointed out by Faveria, John Dock, and Rumaset. And also, there is no way for landless workers to become even tenants. If one was born as the son of the landless household, he has to be landless workers. He cannot become even tenants. Therefore, the suppressing non-tenancy transaction perpetuates the poverty. Setting a ceiling of land holding is also very bad, detrimental to the efficiency of land allocation, particularly when positive relationship emerges between farm size and productivity. Since COP, Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, fails to generate effective land rental market, particularly because of the land ceiling, land is inefficiently allocated even at present. In the face of changing relationship between farm size and productivity, it is critically important for the Philippine government to recognize the role of land market and to shift from anti-land market policy with land ceiling to pro land market policy without land ceiling. Okay, let me conclude my presentation. This is my last slide. The first point I want to emphasize is that the relationship between farm size productivity has been debated for a long time because of the absence of clear recognition that monitoring cost of higher labor is very high in agriculture. This is a fundamental characteristics of agriculture, which we should never forget. IR, inverse relationship, is widely observed in low-income economies where labor-intensive production method is employed. World is changing and inverse relationship has been weakened or even reversed in developing countries in Asia, including the Philippines, where wage rates are rising and mechanization is taking place. Redistributive land reform is detrimental to the efficient allocation of land in such a situation because there are scale economies. In order to maintain efficiency of agriculture in Asian countries, it is imperative to promote land rental transaction and abolish land ceiling so as to reap benefits of mechanization. After all, it should be the market. It should not be the government that determines the land allocation. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, arigato gozaimasu, Professor Otsuka, for that very interesting presentation. And as always, this is a very much debated topic. I'm sure at this point, we will be hearing a lot of questions from the Zoom audience. Let me just, Rainier, 3 times, can you unshare the slide? We already have a few questions in the chat box. Ruel Briones, would you like to ask your question yourself? You can unmute.
Hi,
yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, oh, good morning, Kay. How are you?
thank you. Very good.
Okay, great. Great. Very animated, very interesting, provocative presentation. I just have some exceptions or some clarifications with your concluding remarks. No, it seems to carry a presumption of land ownership as a means of realizing economies of scale but that actually is a question that needs to be investigated. So in my chat box, I've commented, what kind of land tenure is consistent with realizing economies of scale? Is it direct owner control? Could we also realize it by lease rental? Could we realize it by contract farming with certain contractual obligations built in? So we need to clarify this before we can launch into policy recommendations.
Shall I respond?
Yes. Yes.
It doesn't matter. Any land, I believe that any land rental transaction is pretty efficient, including share tenancy. If farmers prefer share tenancy can be accepted.
But contract farming. Contract
farming.
You force the owner to accept mechanization, etc.
I know, Roy, you are the specialist, but I'm also on contract farming. I published a
right.
on contract farming. Contract farming, I don't think contract farming works. Contractor cannot supervise workers.
But you can impose mechanization and all of these labor-saving devices, right?
If we look at Brazil, it's like a company. There are many companies which employ workers. So that kind of system they use a satellite image to supervise the tractor drivers. That kind of thing may be possible in future. If IT is widely adopted and large machines are also used, large management of large farms may become feasible. Corporation can participate in farming.
So it's possible.
Yeah, it's possible. It depends on the extent of mechanization.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, RC Balisacan is raising his hand.
Yeah, just a quick question. Okay, of course, it's a very interesting presentation as usual from you. But in the way you presented the farm size yield productivity relationship, okay? You seem to have ignored what you have always been arguing, that farm size is endogenous. It's responding to cost of labor, to changes in wages, changes in rent, in price of capital, and so as I understand the East Asian experience, including Japan, that the increasing farm size was partly motivated by or induced by rising wages. So there's and mechanization will arise as a result of that wage pressure. In the case of the Philippines, I'm trying to contrast that with the Philippines, where the common problem we have experienced in our post-war industrialization experience that we have failed to develop a rapidly growing and robust manufacturing industry sector where employment is associated with higher productivity and more secured jobs. As a result, labor is stuck in agriculture with rapidly rising population. Wages, relative wages, the relative price of labor is declining relative to the price of capital. So obviously, farm size would decrease, not rise. Of course, there is also the land reform, but I'm still think that it is partly a result of this failure in the structural transformation of the economy that has resulted in a very weak demand for labor, especially in sectors where productivity is or higher productivity is associated with employment. So I would like you to comment on that, Kay, because in part what I see is that the decreasing farm size in the Philippines, notwithstanding the land reform, the decreasing farm size in the Philippines relative to our neighbors is partly a reflection of the performance of our labor market.
Right. Yeah. Right. Thank you.
And then,
okay. Farm size is endogenous. So if we simply run OLS regression, coefficient would be biased. But there are some careful studies which endogenize the farm size. And also in some countries, the farm size is endogenous, can be changed, but it's not easy because of the land reform regulation and so on. So I carefully reviewed the literature, and still I believe that if traditional labor-intensive technologies used, inverse relationship would emerge. The main cause for declining farm size in the Philippines is high population growth and lack of growth of employment in non-farm sectors. I agree with that, and I'm also writing papers on strategy to develop industries. So if you can give me another chance, I'll talk about strategy for development of manufacturing industries. Not necessarily in the Philippines, but I'm particularly interested in Africa. I'm recommending strategy I'm proposing. It's working in Ethiopia now. My main argument is we should transfer management technology from Asia to Africa. And in Ethiopia, actually, Japanese management system is recommended. And I hope Africans will recognize the importance of management. Anyway, that's a bit different issue. Thank you.
Okay, another question from NAST academician Eufemio Rasco. May I invite Eufemio Rasco to ask your question yourself on Zoom? You may show and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Ms. Maha. Well, I'm trying to imagine that the prediction that small farms have no future is actually based on two implicit assumptions. The first is that grains, meaning rice, wheat, corn, and soybeans, will continue to be the main food in the Philippines. And secondly, monoculture of these grains will remain as the dominant practice. So my question is, what makes you believe that these assumptions will hold in the future? Maybe it's true now, but in the future, what makes you believe that these assumptions will remain? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Your question is related with the question of Roel earlier. So as economy develops, demand for grains tend to decline or do not increase at least. So there is a need for farmers to shift crops from staple foods to high-value products like vegetables, fruits, and livestock products. That is going to happen. That should happen also. Although I did not explicitly discuss the importance of shifting resources from rice cultivation to cultivation of more variable high-value products whose demand has been growing. But in order to highlight the importance of reforming agrarian reform law again, I just focused on rice farming in my presentation. But your point is correct.
Okay. There are several questions, but let me entertain them as they come in on chat. Jesus Felipe, would you like to show yourself and ask your question?
I'm here. Thank you so much, Ajay.
Oh,
Good morning,
hi.
everyone. Thank you so much. Great presentation. It's a pleasure
Okay.
seeing you. I have more than a question. It's like what is a question, but it's a clarification. A slightly different nature from the ones that have been posed. This has to do with the. I got a bit lost at some point with the units of the variables that appear. I thought that you began with something that I agree completely when you began talking about Q yield per hectare. That is the units in a production function are physical quantities, and there's something very, very clear precisely in agriculture. When people jump onto other type of production functions, this is a mess, and I'm going to talk about it in a presentation, I think in a couple of weeks. No, Maja? I talk in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
But then when you wrote your production function, everything was very clear to me. But suddenly you start talking about things such as purchase higher inputs. You start talking about TFP. You start talking about things that really are not physical quantities at all. So I don't know whether I got lost somewhere or it's really true that you're very purist when you write the production function in physical terms, but then you jump into a peso or yen or baht, etc. That's not a production function. So maybe it's more a clarification. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. So yield, physical yield, is not a good indicator of the efficiency of production. It is a rough indicator, but it's not. If we allocate a lot of resources for production, then even if efficiency is not high, yield can increase. So a lot of economists are interested in measuring efficiency of farming, efficiency of production for small farms and large farms. For that purpose, total factor productivity or profit per hectare are better indicators. So that's the point I wanted to make. But I jumped from a production function to profit. I needed to explain the profit maximization process in between.
If I can quickly elaborate, all production theory is about physical quantities. So it's not about whether it is labor productivity or TFP. Once you use TFP, I'm absolutely sure, guaranteed that you are not using physical quantities. You need some measure of capital. Immediately, that is a money value. Therefore, that's not a production function. All neoclassical production theory is about physical quantities. So let me retry. I began very, very comfortable when you were talking about yield per something. Then you began talking about money. That's not a production function. All the results of neoclassical production theory are quantities, but this has tremendous implications for things such as, for example, the ones you were mentioning 2 seconds ago in your reply to Professor Rath.
In my view, I have to insert the discussion about profit maximization. I started with production function, and then profit maximization subject to certain constraints, and then derive profit or TFP. Yeah, I just omitted one process.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, another question from Ernie Fernia. Ernesto, Ernie, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Professor Otsuka. I have a simple, more general question. And this has to do with the common impression that the failure of agrarian reform in the Philippines has had to do with the slowness in the implementation of the land reform, which is contrary to what happened in other countries. They were time bound, and so they succeeded. So in the case of the Philippines, because of the slowness in the implementation, in the progress of land reform, in the meantime, this was an inducement actually for a bigger population, and in turn, a bigger population having an impact on productivity, on labor productivity. So can you clarify or respond to that comment or question?
Okay, I'd give either gold medal or silver medal to the Philippines for the implementation of the land reform. India and the Philippines were two most serious countries in implementation of land reform. Marcos did a lot. Particularly in Central Luzon, I conducted a survey of land reform. It was implemented. Land reform is very difficult to implement, right? Because land laws are politically very strong. Even in India, it was very, very difficult. And there are a lot of cheating. And so compared with the other countries, Philippines performed very well in terms of implementation. And also, I suspect, if I'm wrong, please point out, the productivity of tropical fruits in Mindanao seems to have been increasing. Export has been increasing. Production has been increasing at a very rapid pace. I suspect that that is due to destruction of the plantation and replaced it by contract farming, using small farms or former workers as a new farmer. And that system seems to be working. That, if my hypothesis is correct, land reform in the Philippines, in Mindanao, is correct. So I would say land reform was well implemented in the Philippines.
That seems to be contrary to the impression and the comments of many that it has been too slow, and so it has not succeeded. It has failed.
No, it succeeded.
Okay.
Compared with the other countries.
Okay.
At least silver medal.
Silver medal. All right.
Please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, before I call on Butch and then Carl, let me just ask the question from Facebook. So this is from Melba Tutor. Hi, Professor Otsuka. What do you think about making your conclusions based on observation on rice farmers in Central Luzon? To what extent do you think they represent the farming sector in the Philippines?
That's a very good question. It's not representative. It's one of the most advanced regions. So Central Luzon is the kind of future of other regions in the Philippines. But we can see the future from Central Luzon. That's good. No? We are thinking about the future. But that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Butch, your question, Butch.
Hi, Kay. Nice to see you again.
Oh, Butch. We have not seen for years, no?
Okay. You made a very good argument that we cannot justify agrarian reform through efficiency. But could there be an argument for agrarian reform in terms of equity? Because as far as I know, the Department of Agrarian Reform is allowing the integration of farms, like forming cooperatives across the different landowners. And in the process, they could, well, it goes back to the question of Roel, basically. With the integration of, all of these farms through cooperatives, then they can, create certain transactions that could allow for exploiting scale economies. So in that sense, you don't necessarily have to change the agrarian reform. You just simply allow the transactions and in the contracts, and you allow for greater integration through cooperatives.
So you have improved your ability of economics for the last 40 years.
Thank you.
Your point is very, very good. So, for example, destruction of hacienda, replacement of hacienda by small farms is good from the viewpoint of equity. And my point is, redistribution is okay, but land transaction should be allowed. Otherwise, efficiency is unnecessary sacrifice, too much sacrifice. So I'm not against redistribution, but importance of land market should be clearly recognized by the policymaker. By the way, Butch, what's your position now? Are you a professor at Ateneo?
Yeah. I'm still I'm retired, but I'm still teaching.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to see you.
Okay, nice to see you too.
Okay, Carl, and then Ruel, and then I have another one in the chat box.
Hi, Professor Otsuka. I'm Carl from the University of the Philippines. Not really a question, but just a comment on probably some of the things that you have found. Well, basically, the rationale for favoring small farms is that inverse relationship, which is usually justified by agency costs or transaction cost disadvantages of large farms. But you know, agency and transaction costs are naturally increasing with specialization, and so forcing farmers to be owner operators, as in the spirit of the current land reform program, will eliminate such specialization, which eventually drives growth. And I think because of that complexity, even before land reform, agriculture is already complex. For example, shared tenancy has functions beyond the traditional perceived tenant-landlord relationship. It's actually a partnership. For example, landlords contribute innovation, land preparation, and tenants undertake, say, supervision, production management, and management of labor. And so therefore, this partnerships is the one driving specialization. So I think the lesson is diverse conditions in agriculture also call for diverse arrangements. And so therefore we see those patterns that you have shown in your presentation. I think that's all. Thank you.
It's a very complicated question. If you show a mathematical model, I can reply properly.
Yeah, it's just a comment, not necessarily a question, Professor Otsuka.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ruel, you have a quick follow-up?
Sorry, Maha, I'll take advantage of this opportunity. One quick question and one question on my chat. No, first is a reply to Kay on the contract farming. I'm a little less sanguine about the benefits of land reform. I think contract farming was a way to preserve some of the advantages of large-scale operations, especially coordinating across or down the value chain. That there was a tendency to fragment, in the course of land reform. So yeah, the kind of contract farming was a kind of a loophole that was taken advantage of not just by the big agribusiness capitalists, but also by the erstwhile tenants, cum laborers. No, so that's my reply. The other one is a follow-up to actually RC's comments about labor. Since 2011, we've seen in the official statistics a reduction in the absolute numbers of workers in agriculture, right? Which I thought was a very favorable development, but somewhat reversed with 2020 because of the pandemic. But assuming that this resumes, would this bode well for the future of all of the issues that you've been talking about, consolidation and so on and so forth?
So after pandemic is over, probably number of workers in agriculture will continue to decline. That's good. That's good. That's needed for farm size expansion. Regarding contract farming and plantation workers do not know how to manage the farm. They are assigned to do certain specific tasks, spraying pesticides and so on. They do not know the management. So if we divide the plantation into smaller pieces and give them to former workers, production efficiency will be very much lost. Therefore, it's a good idea for contractor, the area owner of the plantation, provide contract farming to former employees and provide instructions. That's the ideal land reform of the plantations. I hope that will happen in many countries. And the Philippine case can be a textbook for other countries.
Okay, let me just entertain this question from our grad student, Rainier. Would you like to ask your question? Rainier, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you there, Rainier? Okay, this is his question. What about the implication of external factors such as the high returns to fish farming, which have led to the conversion of rice farms to fish farms, which is the case in Central Luzon?
That's all. I have never been there for the last several years. I did not know that. It's good. It's good to convert to fish pond. That may be, although problem is a disease. In central Thailand, a lot of paddy fields were converted to shrimp fields. But disease gets spread, and everybody lost. And no more fish farming, other shrimp farming in central Thailand. So if farmers are interested in growing fishes, we need government policy or corrective action of farmers to prevent disease. Otherwise, it's a good idea.
That's a question.
My question, Maha, but can I just...
Your name is registered as Rainier.
Okay, I don't know why. But anyway, so this has been happening since the 80s and 90s, Professor. So it's not just a recent development. So I'm just wondering if the decline can be partly due to not just land reform, but partly due to the conversion of lands to fish farming. And yeah, because there has been a decline, right, in the area, especially in Central Luzon, as you have used Central Luzon as your case study.
Actually, I was a visiting researcher of Erie from 1986 to 89. During a 3-year period, I very often visited Central Luzon, and also later on, once every 3-4 years, I visited there. But I did not observe a lot of conversion of paddy fields to fish ponds. But that's a good development because fish is high value product and production is more profitable.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, before I call RC for the last question, let me just read some comments on the chat box. This is from Irish Joy Ipagire. As a daughter of a farmer tenant, the farm size that my father is working depends on the discretion of the farm owner. My observation here in our place is that there are farm owners who has large farm size, but it was subdivided into tenants. And then another comment from Eufemio Rasco, land reform may have succeeded in breaking up farms, but failed to provide adequate support to beneficiaries. So those are comments in the chat box. RC, you have another follow-up question? Maybe last question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Maha, and sorry for coming again, but I just recall some of the earlier papers of Kay and the relationship between the land markets and credit markets in agriculture. And clearly here in our case, that's a very important angle that somehow hasn't come up yet in the discussion. For example, as when I was looking at the implementation of the agrarian reform about a decade ago, more than 2 decades after the implementation of the agrarian reform program, a lot of the land transferred were in the form of collective land ownership, or what's referred to as cloas, and they were not really parceled into individual titles. And as a result, those lands have lost their attraction as collateral in the credit market. So in effect, the financial market looked at lending to agriculture as a poor prospect, and so there's a diminution of flow of funds into agriculture, and for that, small farmers and the beneficiaries of land reform who had those lands, but they could not access credit, and therefore they could not have the technologies that they would need for to make their farms productive. Could you comment on that, Kay?
I think the credit market is working better now than before. Is microfinance working in the Philippines? So traditionally, fertilizer dealers, rice millers were the sources, very important sources of credit in agriculture, particularly in rice farming, in many countries in Asia. According to Tom Riordan's research studies, that practice has been replaced by microfinance and other modern systems of credit provision. So independent farming can be profitable, and although government did not do much for credit market, but credit market seems to be working better than before.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, it's really an interesting discussion when it comes to farm size and land reform. This is always a debatable issue. It's already 11:13 and we're over time already. But before I invite everyone to our photo session, let me first invite you to the next seminar, which is happening on August 11. And our speaker is here with us, Jesus Felipe. And as always, materials from our seminar can be downloaded in our website. And so please visit our website and also like our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please subscribe to our mailing list so you can receive announcement of the future seminar.